to know a little bit.
It is a pleasure to welcome you to Amherst College this chilly night. My name is James Dizard, and I teach sociology and environmental studies here at Amherst. It is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce to you tonight's panel. Just a few words of background before I introduce each of them and describe the order in which they will speak. Well, get a little background noise, but we can deal with that.
I don't think the mic is on.
This panel is, it's on, or is out, but move close to it. The topic of tonight's panel, a carbon fee to accomplish a number of things that we will here describe, a number of very good things this evening, could not be at this moment in time more important. As I'm sure you all know, the results of the most recent election at the national level bode extremely ill for any constructive forward movement on addressing climate change. We're able to rely on Congress. We're going to have to rely on discovering other methods of putting pressure on the industry, on the oil and gas industry, and the coal industry, to clean up their act, literally and figuratively. It also means that in an important kind of way, the initiative is going to have to be originating in the states, because the federal government is particularly on this issue, but on many issues, operating on gridlock. And so anything that can be done at state and local levels and in the private sector is going to be vitally important in the near and probably even in the medium future to get America on a course of seriously addressing what is arguably the most urgent problem that human beings have ever faced. And just to give you an example, today there was a demonstration at Amherst College urging the trustees to divest. A letter from the faculty was delivered to the trustees and the president of the college in early October, also urging divestment. Alumni bodies are beginning to organize. So this is the kind of thing that seems to me to be urgently necessary, and it is great to see you come out for this panel, because what is going to be addressed here is one of the ways in which, at the state level, a difference can be made. Now, without further discussion of this event, let me just introduce the panelists. Following me, Dan Gatti, who's the Executive Director of Climate XChange, emphasize the X, will give a few remarks about the organization and what it is doing. And then, in the following order, Professor James Boyce of the University of Massachusetts Economics Department will address the issue of a carbon fee and how it operates. And that's really important. It's complicated, but he's a master at making the complex transparent, as he will demonstrate in a few short moments. He will be followed by Tom Conroy, outgoing state legislator from the Middlesex District, who was the author and sponsor of the first carbon tax piece of legislation in Massachusetts. It didn't succeed, but he's going to reflect on that. He will be followed by our representative, local representative, Story of the 3rd Hampshire District, representing Amherst and Pelham, in Congress, in the House since 1992. I can still count it out. I can still remember the first campaign, as a matter of fact. And she will speak briefly to the political prospects of moving this forward. And that is especially important now since obviously the Republican was elected to the government. And she will have some reflections on what that means for the prospects of the sort of legislation that will be proposed tonight. She in turn will be followed by Margaret Bullitt-Jonas, who is an Episcopal priest, now in the Diocese of Western Mass. She graduated from the Grace Episcopal Church to a much larger community of congregations. And she will talk talk directly to the ethical imperatives that confront us by the prospect of climate change. So, Dan.
Thank you so much, Jan. I just want to start by just giving you a few thank yous for all the people who helped make this event possible, starting with my brilliant wife, Ophelia, who has, she's back there, but she's been running around helping organize this forum just in the past hour. She has been working tirelessly to help me, and I really appreciate everything that she's done. In addition, Solomon Goldstein Rose, who couldn't be here today because in addition to being a terrific organizer out here in Western Mass, he's also a student at Brown University. But he was absolutely critical. Dave Roydman, there in the front row, he has done a killer job for us. Shira Rasco is back there taking photographs, and Rebecca Morris, both of whom are part of Climate XChange. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, so that's 350 Massachusetts, Clean Water Action, Green Amherst, Mothers Out Front, the Amherst League of Women Voters, the Center for Ecotechnology, and Co-op Power. Really appreciate your support. So I'm going to start with the question that I think is the fundamental question that's driven our organization, which is what would happen if we put a tax on oil and gas companies and gave the money back to the people. That's the basic idea of the carbon fee and rebate, and it's a policy concept that is quickly becoming one of the hottest ideas in climate policy today. And I should say, this policy idea goes by a couple of different names, right? So if you're James Hansen with the organization Citizens Climate Lobby, or Bill McKibben, it's fee and dividend. If you're Senator Maria Cantwell, Senator Susan Collins, it's cap and dividend. Former Bush administration Treasury Secretary, to give you a sense of the breadth of support on this, Henry Paulson, refers to it as a revenue-neutral carbon tax. But the basic idea of all of these, the basic idea is the same. What we need to do is we need to put a price on carbon and take the revenues and give it back to the people. That price on carbon will hold big polluters accountable for the damage that fossil fuels do to our world. And by giving the money back to the people will ensure that this can be popular, that this will be good for the middle class and for poor people. My organization, Climate XChange, was founded a year and a half ago by a group of grassroots activists who were inspired by this policy model and were frustrated at the lack of action that we see happening at the federal level. Our merry band of grassroots activists put together $35,000 of our own money to fund a study looking at what would happen if we passed this kind of policy here in Massachusetts. I want to just briefly say three things that we found and one thing that we believe as the result of our work over the past year and a half. First, a carbon fee and rebate would inspire a wave of investment in clean energy and efficiency. By holding oil and gas companies accountable for their pollution, we'll finally be able to create a fair playing field for new technologies like solar and wind. And as we increase our use of clean energy and as we become more efficient in the way that we use energy, we can eliminate the need for new pipelines. Second, a carbon fee and rebate would be good for our economy. As we start shifting away from fossil fuels that we import into the state, fossil fuels that we import either from other states like Pennsylvania or from other countries like Nigeria or Saudi Arabia, we'll produce more jobs here in Massachusetts. In fact, according to our study, we could create over 10,000 new jobs through this policy. Third, carbon fee and rebate would be good for the poor and the middle class. That's because wealthy people tend to have higher energy costs, which means that when you give the money back to the people, poor people and middle class people will do a lot better. So those are the major things that we found. And then the thing that we believe is that we believe that if we can enact this policy here in Massachusetts, and if we can prove that carbon pricing can be good for our economy, good for our environment, and good for regular folks in this state, we believe that we can change the conversation about climate policy in this country, finally breaking the connection that people feel between the cost of living and the cost of fossil fuels. And Massachusetts has a unique role in our democracy, right? We're the state that first legalized gay marriage, that first recognized gay marriage, and put that issue on the national agenda. When federal policymakers were looking for a national solution to universal health care, They based their model, the national model, on a model that we had demonstrated and proven here in Massachusetts first. So we really believe that this state has a critical leadership role to play, and we think that getting this started here in Massachusetts can be a great step for climate policy around the country and climate policy around the world. So with that, I'll leave it to the rest of this great panel. And thank you all very much for coming today.
Right, well, I want to thank you all for coming out on this chilly evening. And since Dan did a shout out to the various members of the audience, I just want to do a shout out to a few friends I see here. Olivia and Alexander, hi guys. Karen, Dick Stein, very nice to see you here tonight. Dan has already mentioned a couple of the points that I intended to make, so I'll try to make them briefly and then add a few other things. I think the question of whether we should price carbon is in many ways a no-brainer. They asked me to try to persuade you that that was a good idea. But I think you're here because you recognize that there is a problem with burning fossil fuels. Actually, there are a number of problems. And there are basically only two ways we can go about addressing those problems, and I think both of them are important. One is to come up with regulations that limit our use of fossil fuels. The automobile fuel efficiency standards and new and old power plant standards that the Obama administration is putting in place are examples of those regulations. And that's a good thing. I'm not against regulations. However, I think that unless one actually puts a price on carbon emissions, unless one recognizes that the ability of the biosphere to absorb carbon is limited, scarce, and therefore people should pay to use this scarce resource, unless we stop treating it as a free good. Throwing up regulations is kind of like putting up dams against the flow of the river. It can slow things down, but in the end, the water always wants to flow downhill, flow down towards the cheapest energy price in this case. So I think putting the price on carbon emissions is really a critical piece of the policy mix. Not the only policy, not the panacea, but absolutely fundamental and critical. And indeed, there are many good reasons that involve economic efficiency to use a price as a major mechanism for engineering the clean energy transition. The price can be put on in various ways. I was happy to see that the way it's been advertised tonight is as a fee and rebate program, because fee is kind of a vague term. It sometimes is used as a euphemism for a tax, because people, especially politicians, are a little bit averse to the T word. But a fee can be arranged, a price can be arranged in multiple ways, and one of them is to have a tax, where you set the price and let the quantity of emissions adjust. Another way is to set a cap on the quantity of carbon you allow into your economy, the quantity of coal, oil, and natural gas that comes into the state of Massachusetts in this case, and then you auction off those permits and you let the price adjust. That is a cap and auction policy. Another way is to put on a cap and give away the permits for free, and because you're giving them away for free to historic polluters on the basis of some more or less arbitrary formula, usually described by the ageist and sexist term grandfathering. I'm about to be a grandfather, so I really object to that. I call it cap and giveaway, but cap and giveaway means you have to trade. You have trades as well, because some get more than they need and others get less than they need, and they use the market to allocate them efficiently. If you auction the permits, of course, there's no reason to have a trade. Cap and auction dispenses with any need for trading, dispenses with any need for anybody other than the fossil fuel firms themselves to pay the fees, dispenses with any need for Wall Street to get into the game, to try to manipulate the market, create derivatives, speculate, etc., etc. All of that gets wiped out if you have either a tax or cap and auction policy. They're the same thing, basically. A tax sets the price, lets the quantity adjust. A cap sets the quantity, lets the price adjust. Other than that, they're equivalent. Now, putting a price on carbon is going to be a big deal. It's going to raise prices considerably. And Jan mentioned the adverse results of the national elections. I want to remind you of an adverse result of our state elections as well, which was question 1, which repealed, the voters of Massachusetts in this very blue of blue states repealed a measure that would have inflation indexed our rather modest gasoline tax. Inflation indexing it would have added about 1 cent per gallon to the price of gasoline. The voters weren't willing to pay that extra 1 cent per gallon. Right? So, what are we talking about in putting the price of carbon? We're not talking about 1 cent. We're talking about dollars. Dollars, folks. Not only on gasoline, but on heating oil, on the fuels that are burned, the fossil fuels burned by electricity producers. We're talking about something orders of magnitude more substantial than what the voters of Massachusetts just rejected. So, are we all dreamers? Right? Is this like a fantasy, and we're like a little club here getting together to fantasize about an alternative universe? We live in a real world, a political world. And so what I want to say a few words about is the problem of how to devise a policy and a message that actually could command public support. Not only to get a bill passed, which is of course the first step, but to retain public support for that bill over the decades needed to achieve a clean energy transition. And I think part of the reframing of the message has to be moving away from the old environmentalist message that we in the present must sacrifice for the benefit of future generations. Of course, most people have a fond spot for future generations, especially if they're about to be a grandfather, or grandmother, but when push comes to shove, they also have to, pay their bills, send their kids to college, pay the rent, all that kind of stuff. And it's a tough thing to pit your present welfare against future generations. And yet that's been the way that a lot of the climate message has been framed. I think we need to reframe that. We need to reframe this as something that's good for us today, right? And one way to do that is to talk about the public health co-benefits of cleaner air, which come with climate policy. The International Monetary Fund just in September put out a report saying that for all of the 20 top carbon emitters, ignoring the problem of climate change, the public health damages from burning fossil fuels are enough to justify a very aggressive policy to reduce carbon emissions, including putting a price on carbon. Those public health benefits need to be lifted up. Secondly, we need to lift up the job benefits of the clean energy transition. It is incredible that carbon policy, climate policy, is successfully portrayed by so many in the political and public media arena as job killing. In fact, building out a whole set of new energy infrastructure, that's job creating. Moreover, these are jobs in the United States as opposed to jobs drilling, for oil and God knows where. So those health and job benefits are important, but there is also this issue, this little issue of the price on carbon emissions, right? We're going to be jacking up gasoline prices by dollars per gallon over the course of this transition, right? It's the most public price in America. It's advertised in 12-inch eye numbers on street corners across the country. People know that price. How do you get them to think that it's worth paying that price? And I think this is where what Dan referred to as a rebate, or what others refer to as a dividend, is the way to go. The basic underlying philosophical principle here is that we're taking what economists call an open access resource, carbon absorptive capacity of the biosphere. It's been treated as something that's free and unlimited in supply, and instead we're making people pay to use it. And the question is, where does the money go? In other words, if they're paying, who gets what they pay? Which basically means who owns the limited carbon absorptive capacity of the atmosphere. And I would suggest to you that who owns it is not the corporations, hence no giveaway of permits. It's not the government either. The government doesn't own it either. It's owned by you and me, by every man, woman, and child in equal and common measure. That's the underlying philosophical principle behind cap and dividend, fee and rebate, whatever you want to call it. The money that's paid to use that limited resource should go back to all of us, because this is a gift of creation, a gift of nature that we all share. If you put it back to the people in that way, the majority of households come out ahead in sheer financial terms. So money-wise, as they see the prices go up at the pump, that's putting more money in their pocket because they're getting more than they spend. How can the majority get more than they spend? Because income and expenditure are so skewed in this country, it's so unequal that the consumption of carbon like everything else, is concentrated at the top. So the 1%, indeed the top 20 or 25%, pay more than they receive back in their dividend because they consume more carbon, just like they consume more everything else. But the middle class is kept whole, and lower income people, lower income households actually come out ahead. So it has a modest effect towards redistributing income in a more egalitarian fashion, which is another big social problem. But most importantly, it maintains public support for pricing carbon, which otherwise, I want you to understand this, otherwise it is a regressive tax, right? The poor spend more on fuels than do the rich as a percentage of their income, not in absolute terms. The rich, of course, spend more because they spend more on everything. But as a percentage of income, the poor spend more because fuels are a necessity, not a luxury, right? And so if you have a tax on carbon, if you raise the gasoline tax even, you're going to hit the poor harder than you're going to hit the rich as a percentage of their incomes. You know, John Boehner, when the Waxman-Markey bill was being debated on the floor of the House, said this would be the biggest tax increase on working Americans in history. Right? Well, that's political hyperbole. But Boehner was basically right. This would be like a big tax, and it would hit working families. The Democrats dissembled about that. They confused, either out of ignorance or out of disingenuity, they confused the price put on carbon emissions that are not abated with the cost of actually reducing emissions, which are quite modest. And so they said, oh, it's only 18 cents a day, it's a postage stamp. Even Paul Krugman, who I more or less respect, wrote this in the New York Times, right? It's completely wrong, right? We're not talking here about the price of reducing carbon emissions by putting in insulation in your house or, you know, building windmills. We're talking about the price on the emissions not abated, the price on the fossil fuels that are consumed, which are providing the incentive for all those investments, right? And that price is big. It is like a tax, right? It is. Boehner was right. Just because he was a Republican and said it doesn't necessarily mean it was wrong, right? I'm open-minded. I'm bipartisan in this respect, right? It is like a tax, and the only way I think you're going to get the public to accept that price, call it a tax, call it a fee, call it what you want, the only way you can get them to accept it is to make sure that they see the money come back into their pockets in a visible, transparent, and fair fashion. In the same way that Alaska provides to every man, woman, and child in the state of Alaska a dividend every year that comes out of the royalties on Alaska's oil production. It's the same basic idea. If Alaska could do it, that was, by the way, a Republican governor who put that in place. The biggest payout ever was done by Sarah Palin. If they can do it in Alaska, I think we can do it in Massachusetts.
Well, Tom, we tried it in Massachusetts.
Yes, we did. We did. I just want to say thank you for creating the opportunity for us to talk about this very important issue tonight and for inviting me to serve on the panel with my very distinguished and esteemed colleague, Ellen Story, your representative here in Hampshire County and 3rd Hampshire District. Is that right, Ellen? So, and I just wanted to say thank you to Dan and the professor for being such fabulous and articulate experts on this issue in particular, and environmentalists writ large. They have a lot more expertise in this area than I do, and then I would like to just take 1 minute to explain 30 years of my history and sort of how I got to a point where I authored this bill a couple of years ago and introduced it in January of 2013. And as mentioned, it did not get very far, but sort of the summary of my remarks is that it will be reintroduced in 2 months. A new legislative session will start, and with your help, and your advocacy, and your energy, and everybody on this panel, and people all across this Commonwealth, we might get to see some real action on this carbon fee and rebate or carbon tax bill in Massachusetts, and really make it groundbreaking and set up a model, as Dan mentioned, for the rest of the country to follow. So that's certainly my goal and something that I hope we can see happen. So 30 years in 1 minute. 1980s, I worked for Gary Hart, senator from Colorado. His best friend, Tim Wirth, was the guy who taught In Tim Worth's words, everything Al Gore got to know about the environment, he learned from Tim Worth. So I was educated in part by those two senators as well, and it put this bee in my bonnet about clean energy, solar power, the importance of clean water, the importance of addressing this tragedy of the commons that is greenhouse gases and carbon pollution in our air. 1990s, Defense Intelligence Agency came out with a report that said our economy is threatened and the world economy is threatened because seas are going to rise between 5 and 8 feet over the course of the next 50 or 100 years unless we deal with this climate change problem. We had the failure of Kyoto, but there was recognition. The victory of Kyoto in 1997 was we were starting to grapple with this issue. The failure was that nothing really happened, and we, the United States, were not signatories, and all that bad energy dissipated. In the 2000s, I continued to learn about the issue. 2003, Rebate went into place, basically putting a cap on the amount of pollution that the producers of energy and fossil fuel creation and all the pollution that comes with that. That Rebate Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative got put in place here in New England and 3 other states, and that has helped, but it really only addresses about 1/3 of the pollution that's created, so we need to tackle the other 66%. CAFE standards, which are the emissions that come out of cars that are basically put a limit on that by saying that cars need to have certain mileage per gallon standards and meet those standards by company. Those have been held back for 50 years, basically by one guy, John Dignan, the congressman who ran the Energy and Commerce Committee for about 40 of those 50 years, and he happens to be from Detroit. So that is why we don't have a standard, CAFE standards with 50 miles per gallon. Hopefully that can change now that he's left. But that is something that I was keenly aware of over the course of the past 30 years. And in 2012, or I guess I should say 2007, I came into the legislature. We had a huge transportation financing problem. Huge, and we still have it, because as just mentioned, we raised the gas tax a measly 3 cents, which is going to amount to about $100 million a year when we need $1 billion a year to maintain and fix our broken roads, bridges, railway lines, signaling, etc., all throughout this Commonwealth. So there's a lot more that we need to do, and I knew that we had to tackle this issue even before that 3 cents became law this session. Again, put yourself in 2012, and I'm thinking, how are we going to come up with a transportation finance package that addresses the needs we have in transportation, addresses the environment, because I care deeply about it, addresses the issue of changing behavior and getting people to pay this. You know, a tax has 2 purposes. It raises revenue and it changes behavior. And that's why this is so much better, I think, than a cap and auction or a cap and trade. Because it gets everybody involved, and everybody has to pay attention. And that's the beauty of it. So I crafted this bill that basically puts a fee on the distributors of anybody who's producing that fossil fuel emissions, so gas stations and home heating fuel distributors and the like. That is a fee system that is in place right now. There's no additional administrative burden. It works. Adding a price on carbon on top of what these folks are already paying in terms of taxes is very simple to do. And it would transfer that payment to the consumers of gas, to the consumers of fossil fuel-created home heating oil. And of course, building owners who are owning big buildings all throughout the home. Sure, that would change the way we would think about creating energy efficiency, buying different cars and heating our home.